In January of 1998, the streets of Seoul witnessed one of the most surreal and heartbreaking spectacles in modern economic history. It was the dead of winter, biting cold, yet tens of thousands of ordinary citizens were lining up outside banks, community centers, and schools, stretching for city blocks. They weren't queuing for food rations, and they weren't fleeing a war zone, at least not a military one. They were standing in line to give away their wealth. Housewives brought their wedding rings. Grandmothers unclasped pure gold hairpins that had been in their families for generations. Businessmen took off their gold watches, and athletes brought in their gold medals won at the Olympics. In a matter of months, over 3.5 million people, nearly a quarter of the country's entire population, voluntarily donated their gold to the government. They were melting down their personal histories, their memories, and their savings, all to be smelted into ingots and shipped overseas to the United States and Europe. They were doing this because their country, South Korea, the shining star of the Asian miracle, was effectively bankrupt. They had been told that their sacrifice was necessary to pay back a debt that felt impossible to understand, a debt owed to a shadowy savior that had just landed in Asia with a suitcase full of cash and a contract full of poison. That savior was the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and what was happening on the streets of Seoul was the final tragic act of a financial conquest that had begun months earlier in the humidity of Bangkok. To the history books, this period is known dryly as the Asian financial crisis of 1997. But to the people who lived through it, to the millions who lost their jobs, their businesses, and their dignity, it wasn't just a crisis. It was a raid. It was the moment the West, led by the IMF, ostensibly arrived to put out a fire, only to pour gasoline on the flames and then buy up the charred remains for pennies on the dollar. To understand how the Asian tigers, the most explosive economic engines the world had ever seen, were brought to their knees in a matter of weeks, we have to look past the official reports and the sanitized headlines of the 1990s. We have to look at the mechanics of a trap that was set years before the crash, a trap built on easy money, hubris, and a fundamental misunderstanding of who actually controlled the global financial system. To see the magnitude of the fall, you first have to understand the height of the rise. Before the chaos of 1997, East Asia wasn't just doing well, it was the envy of the entire planet. For 3 decades, countries like South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia had transformed themselves from agrarian backwaters into industrial powerhouses. They were the Asian tigers, and their roar was deafening. The formula seemed magical in its simplicity. These governments opened their borders to foreign investment, they educated their populations, they kept wages competitive, and they exported their way to prosperity. Western economists looked at Asia and called it a miracle. The World Bank published reports praising their fiscal discipline. Seoul transformed from a war-torn ruin into a neon-lit metropolis of the future. Kuala Lumpur began constructing the Petronas Towers, which would become the tallest buildings in the world, a physical symbol of the shift in global power from the west to the east. It felt like the Asian century had arrived early. Money was flooding in from everywhere. Wall Street bankers, London fund managers, and European pension funds were tripping over themselves to throw capital at Asian banks and corporations. If you were a Western investor in the mid-90s, you couldn't afford not to be in Asia. The returns were too high, the growth too fast. But there was a fatal flaw in this miracle. A crack in the foundation that was being paved over with gold. The problem wasn't just that money was flowing in, it was the kind of money that was flowing in. It was hot money, short-term loans, denominated in foreign currencies like the US dollar. Asian banks were borrowing dollars at low interest rates from the West, and then lending that money out in their local currencies to local businesses for real estate projects, factories, and massive infrastructure expansions. It was a carry trade on a continental scale. Everything worked beautifully as long as 2 conditions held true. First, the local Asian currencies had to remain stable against the dollar. Most of these countries had pegged their currencies to the US dollar to give foreign investors confidence. A Thai businessman knew that 25 baht would always equal $1, give or take a few cents. This stability was the bedrock of the entire boom. Second, the money had to keep flowing. As long as the music played, everyone could dance. But in the mid-1990s, the music began to slow down, and the conductor was the United States Federal Reserve. The U.S. economy began to strengthen, and interest rates in America started to rise. Suddenly, the dollar became stronger, and because the Asian currencies were tied to the dollar, they were dragged up with it. This was a disaster for exporters. A stronger currency meant Thai rice and Korean cars became more expensive for the rest of the world to buy. Exports slowed. The economic engine began to sputter. At the same time, China was devaluing its own currency, undercutting its neighbors and stealing their market share. The Asian tigers were being squeezed from both sides, but instead of slowing down, the borrowing accelerated. Corporations and banks, drunk on a decade of growth, kept taking on more dollar debt, assuming the government would never let the currency peg break. They were wrong. They didn't realize that in the shadows of the global financial markets, A new breed of predator had evolved: the currency speculator. Hedge funds in New York and London began looking at the balance sheets of countries like Thailand and noticed a discrepancy. Thailand had billions of dollars in short-term debt, but its central bank only had a limited amount of foreign currency reserves to defend the baht. It was simple arithmetic. If the speculators could sell enough baht, they could force the price down, overwhelm the central bank, and break the peg. It was a hunt, and Thailand was the wounded prey. The attack began in the spring of 1997. Speculators, utilizing sophisticated financial instruments, began short-selling the Thai baht in massive volumes. They were betting that the currency would collapse. The Bank of Thailand fought back desperately. They spent billions of their precious dollar reserves buying up their own currency to prop up its value. They raised interest rates to try and make holding the baht more attractive. But it was a war of attrition, and the speculators had more ammunition than the central bank. The government lied to the public, assuring everyone that the peg was safe, that the economy was sound, that the foreigners would be defeated. But behind closed doors, the vaults were running empty. On July 1997, the inevitable happened. Thailand ran out of money. The government was forced to float the baht. The peg was broken. Instantly, the currency crashed. It lost half its value in a matter of months. This was the trigger the world had been fearing, though no one predicted the sheer scale of the explosion. The collapse of the baht didn't just hurt Thailand. It shattered the psychological illusion of Asian invincibility. Foreign investors, who had been throwing money at the region for years, suddenly panicked. They realized that if Thailand could break, then maybe Malaysia wasn't safe. Maybe Indonesia was a house of cards. Maybe even the mighty South Korea was vulnerable. The hot money that had flowed in so easily now turned around and fled at the speed of light. It was a classic bank run, but not on a single bank, on an entire region. Capital flight is a sterile term for a violent reality. When billions of dollars leave a country overnight, the credit system simply stops. Banks stop lending. Businesses, even profitable ones, cannot get the cash to buy raw materials or pay their workers. Construction cranes on the skylines of Bangkok and Jakarta stopped moving. Factories went silent. And then came the debt bomb. Remember, these countries had borrowed in US dollars. When their local currencies crashed, the cost of paying back those debts doubled or tripled overnight. A Thai company that owed $1 million suddenly needed twice as much baht to pay it back. It was mathematically impossible. Insolvency swept through the corporate sector like a plague. In Indonesia, the rupiah collapsed so dramatically that the entire corporate sector was technically bankrupt within weeks. Inflation skyrocketed. Food prices soared. People who had been middle class a month ago were suddenly fighting to afford rice. The social contract was tearing apart. In the streets of Jakarta, riots broke out. Shopping malls were burned. Anger was palpable, but it was unfocused. People blamed their governments. They blamed corruption. They blamed the speculators. But the governments were paralyzed. They had no tools left. Their reserves were gone, their currencies were worthless, and their creditors were banging on the door demanding payment in dollars they didn't have. They had only one option left. They had to call the lender of last resort. They had to call Washington, D.C. They had to call the IMF. The arrival of the International Monetary Fund is usually presented as a rescue mission. The narrative is that of a benevolent doctor arriving at the bedside of a critically ill patient, administering bitter medicine to save a life. But in 1997, the doctor arrived not with medicine, but with a hacksaw. The IMF, led by Michel Camdesis, did not view the Asian crisis as a mere liquidity problem, where countries just needed a temporary bridge loan to calm the panic. They viewed it as a structural failure of the Asian model itself. They believed that the close relationships between Asian governments, banks, and corporations, the very system that had built the miracle, was actually crony capitalism and had to be dismantled. And they saw this crisis as the perfect opportunity to do it. When the IMF negotiators landed in Bangkok, Jakarta, and Seoul, they held all the cards. These countries were desperate. They needed cash to pay their debts and import food and fuel. Without the IMF's stamp of approval, no other bank in the world would lend them a dime. So the IMF laid out its conditions. These were not suggestions, they were mandates, and they were brutal. The IMF demanded that these governments raise interest rates to astronomical levels, sometimes as high as 30 or 40%. The logic was that high interest rates would attract foreign capital back and stabilize the currency. But in an economy that was already suffocating from debt, raising interest rates was like cutting off the oxygen supply to a drowning man. It ensured that even healthy companies would go bust. They demanded deep cuts in government spending, austerity measures that slashed subsidies for food and fuel right when the populations were most vulnerable. They demanded the privatization of state-owned enterprises. They demanded that the markets be cracked open to foreign ownership. The leaders of these nations were stunned. They argued that these policies would cause a depression, that they would destroy the real economy. They pointed out that their governments were actually fiscally responsible. that they didn't have budget deficits, so why was the IMF forcing austerity on them? It didn't make economic sense for the specific problems they were facing, but the IMF was immovable. It was their way, or total collapse. One by one, the Asian tigers signed. The image of Suharto signing the IMF letter of intent, stooped over a desk while Camdesis stood over him with arms crossed, staring down like a colonial schoolmaster, became the defining image of the era. It was a visual representation of the power dynamic shift. Sovereignty was being signed away in exchange for a lifeline that felt more like a noose. And as the ink dried on those contracts, the second phase of the disaster began. The IMF's medicine did exactly what the Asian leaders feared. The high interest rates crushed the remaining businesses. Unemployment soared to levels never seen before. In South Korea, the suicide rate spiked as proud men who had built their lives on the promise of the economic miracle found themselves destitute. The social safety nets, weak to begin with, were shredded by the spending cuts. But amidst this carnage, something else was happening. Something that would lead many to question whether the destruction of the Asian economies was not just a side effect of the IMF's incompetence, but a feature of its design. As the local companies collapsed and the stock markets hit rock bottom, the assets of Asia, the factories, the real estate, the banks, the telecommunications networks, were suddenly on sale, and they were on sale in dollars. The devastation that followed the IMF's intervention was not merely a matter of economic contraction, it was a wholesale liquidation of national sovereignty. To understand the depth of the Great Rescue Scam, one must look at who ended up owning the pieces of the shattered Asian economies when the smoke cleared. The IMF's structural adjustment programs had a very specific two-pronged effect. First, by forcing interest rates to stratospheric levels, 20, 30, even 60%, they ensured that domestic Asian companies could not survive. Even profitable, well-run factories could not service their debts at those rates. They were strangled to death by the very cure that was supposed to save them. This created a massive wave of bankruptcies, leaving thousands of valuable assets, modern factories, prime real estate, functioning telecommunications networks, technically insolvent and desperate for cash. Second, the IMF demanded, as a non-negotiable condition of their loans, that these countries completely dismantle their laws protecting domestic industries from foreign ownership. Before 1997, countries like South Korea and Thailand had strict rules preventing foreigners from owning majority stakes in key national industries. The IMF argued these rules were barriers to efficiency. They forced the doors wide open. The result was a fire sale on a continental scale, arguably the greatest transfer of wealth from the East to the West in the 20th century. With local currencies devalued by 50 to 80% and asset prices crashed by the Depression, Western corporations with pockets full of strong U.S. dollars went on a shopping spree. They were able to buy up the backbone of Asian industry for pennies on the dollar. It was a scavenger's paradise. In South Korea, the crown jewels of the economy were snapped up. Volvo bought Samsung's construction equipment division. Bowater bought the Hala Paper Company. P&G acquired Sangyong Paper. In Thailand, foreign banks moved in to take control of the domestic financial sector. The very investors and banks who had helped fuel the bubble with reckless lending were now returning as conquerors, buying the wreckage they had helped create at a steep discount. This was not a rescue. It was a hostile takeover disguised as aid. The local populations watched in horror as the companies their fathers and grandfathers had built were sold off to foreign conglomerates. The psychological toll was immense. The Asian miracle had been built on a fierce sense of national pride and independence. Now, that independence was being auctioned off in boardrooms in New York and London, facilitated by the technocrats of the IMF. Nowhere was this tragedy more visceral, more violent, and more heartbreaking than in Indonesia. If South Korea was the corporate tragedy of the crisis, Indonesia was the humanitarian catastrophe. The archipelago nation was ruled by General Suharto, a dictator who had held power for 30 years. His regime was corrupt, yes, but it had also overseen a period of stability and growth that had lifted millions out of poverty. When the rupiah collapsed, it didn't just slide, it disintegrated. From 2,400 rupiah to the dollar to over 16,000 in a matter of months. The economy simply ceased to function. But unlike in Korea, where the anger was channeled into sacrifice, in Indonesia it exploded into chaos. The IMF's demand to eliminate subsidies on fuel and food, kerosene and rice, was the spark that lit the fuse. For the poor in Jakarta, these subsidies were the difference between eating and starving. When the prices tripled overnight, the social fabric tore apart. In May of 1998, Jakarta burned. Riots swept through this capital. Desperate and angry mobs targeted shopping malls and commercial districts. But as is so often the case in history, the anger was manipulated and directed toward a scapegoat. The ethnic Chinese minority in Indonesia, who controlled a significant portion of the commercial economy, became the targets of horrific violence. Shops were looted and burned, women were assaulted, and families were dragged from their homes. It was a pogrom born of economic despair. While the IMF bureaucrats sat in air-conditioned hotels reviewing balance sheets and demanding fiscal discipline, the streets outside were running with blood. The West watched on CNN as Jakarta turned into a war zone, often framing it as the inevitable result of crony capitalism and corruption, conveniently ignoring that the match had been struck by the removal of the very subsidies the IMF had insisted were market distortions. Suharto, the strongman who had seemed invincible, was forced to step down, his regime crumbling under the weight of the economic collapse. It was a political revolution, but it was born of absolute misery. The poverty rate in Indonesia doubled. Decades of development gains were wiped out. Children dropped out of school to work. Infant malnutrition spiked. This was the human cost of stabilizing the currency. Meanwhile, back in the financial capitals of the West, a different kind of rescue was taking place. While the IMF was preaching austerity and pain for the Asian borrowers, they were ensuring that the Western lenders were made whole. This is the most cynical aspect of the entire crisis, the concept of moral hazard. The banks in New York, Tokyo, and Frankfurt had lent billions to Asian companies without doing proper due diligence. In a true free market, when you make a bad loan, you lose your money. That is the risk you take for the reward of interest. But the IMF intervention effectively bailed out these international banks. By lending billions to the Asian governments, the IMF gave them the cash to pay back the foreign creditors. The money went from the IMF to the Thai or Korean central bank, and then immediately out the back door to Citigroup, Chase Manhattan, and Deutsche Bank. The Western banks got their principal back. The Asian taxpayers were left with the debt to the IMF, which they would have to pay off for decades. It was a wealth transfer mechanism that socialized the losses of Wall Street and privatized the pain onto the Asian working class. The message sent to the global financial system was clear. Reckless lending in emerging markets is risk-free. If things go wrong, the IMF will step in, squeeze the locals, and ensure the foreign banks get paid. This double standard was glaringly obvious in the case of South Korea as chaebols, the massive family-run conglomerates like Samsung, Hyundai, and Daewoo that dominated the economy. The IMF diagnosed these conglomerates as bloated and inefficient, demanding they be broken up and restructured. They forced the government to let some of them fail. Daewoo, one of the largest companies in the world, was allowed to collapse, a shockwave that destroyed thousands of jobs. Yet, in 1998, when a massive American hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management, LTCM, threatened to collapse due to bad bets in Russia and Asia, the U.S. Federal Reserve orchestrated a massive bailout to save it, fearing its failure would damage the global system. The hypocrisy was not lost on Asian observers. When an Asian giant tottered, it was market discipline and necessary creative destruction. When a Western giant tottered, it was systemic risk that required state intervention. The resentment bred during these years would fundamentally reshape the geopolitical landscape of the 21st century. Asian leaders looked at what happened to them and vowed never again. They realized that relying on Western capital and the IMF was a death sentence. They realized that in the moment of crisis, they were on their own. This realization is what drove the massive accumulation of foreign exchange reserves by Asian central banks in the years that followed. They started hoarding dollars, trillions of them, building a fortress so that they would never again have to go begging to Washington. It was the beginning of the decoupling, the seed of the desire for an alternative financial system. But before that new future could be built, the region had to survive the immediate winter of 1998. The fire sale continued. The cultural imperialism of the West ramped up, with Western consultants and auditors flooding into Asian offices, dictating how business should be done, imposing Western standards on cultures that had been doing business successfully for centuries. It was a humiliation that cut deep. In South Korea, the gold collection movement had ended, but the gold was gone, melted down, and shipped away to service the debt. The physical wealth of the nation had been extracted, but the spirit of resistance was beginning to harden. They were paying the price, but they were taking notes. They were learning the brutal reality of the global order, that the system is rigged, that the house always wins, and that if you want to survive, you don't play by their rules, you have to build your own. This is part 3 of the narrative. Amidst the wreckage of the Asian tigers, where economies lay in ruins and national treasures were being auctioned off to Western bidders, one nation stood alone, refusing to kneel. If Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea were the cautionary tales of what happens when you submit to the global financial orthodoxy, Malaysia became the dangerous experiment of what happens when you defy it. At the helm was Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, a combative and sharp-tongued leader who viewed the unfolding crisis not as a natural disaster, but as a man-made catastrophe engineered by Western speculators. While the leaders of his neighboring countries were quietly signing the IMF letters of intent and accepting the humiliation of austerity, Mahathir was publicly waging a war of words against the morons of the currency markets. He singled out George Soros, the legendary hedge fund manager, accusing him and others of being economic war criminals who destroyed decades of hard work for the sake of a quick profit. The Western media mocked Mahathir. They painted him as an out-of-touch autocrat looking for a scapegoat to blame for his own corruption and mismanagement. The editors of the Wall Street Journal and The Economist confidently predicted that Malaysia would be the next domino to fall, and that without the IMF's help, the country would spiral into oblivion. But Mahathir was doing more than just shouting. He was planning a heresy. In the late summer of 1998, as the crisis threatened to drag Malaysia into the same abyss that had swallowed Indonesia, Mahathir did the unthinkable. He fired his finance minister, who favored the IMF approach and took control of the economy himself. On September 1st, 1998, he dropped a nuclear bomb on the global financial system. He announced that Malaysia was imposing strict capital controls. He pegged the ringgit at 380 to the US dollar and, crucially, made it illegal to take money out of the country. He banned the trading of the ringgit outside of Malaysia. He told the foreign investors, the hedge funds, and the banks that if they wanted to leave, they couldn't. Their money was trapped. To the neoliberal economists in Washington and London, this was economic suicide. It was a violation of the sacred laws of the free market. You do not lock the doors of the burning building. You are supposed to let the market find its equilibrium. The IMF screamed that this would make Malaysia a pariah state, that foreign investment would never return, and that the economy would rot from the inside. They were wrong, spectacularly, undeniably wrong. By locking the capital account, Mahathir stopped the bleeding. He broke the link between domestic interest rates and the currency. Because the money couldn't leave, he didn't need to raise interest rates to bribe it to stay. Instead of the crushing 20 or 30% interest rates that were destroying businesses in South Korea and Thailand, Malaysia lowered its interest rates. This allowed Malaysian companies to breathe, to borrow, and to keep operating. The economy didn't collapse, it stabilized. Within a year, Malaysia was recovering, its stock market rebounded, its foreign reserves grew, and it did not suffer the mass unemployment, the riots, or the fire sale of national assets that plagued its neighbors. Most importantly, Malaysia kept its sovereignty. It did not have to sell its banks to Wall Street or its water companies to London. Mahathir had proven that the IMF's medicine was not only unnecessary but poisonous. It was a humiliating realization for the Western experts. Years later, even the IMF would quietly release reports admitting that capital controls, the very thing they had demonized, were actually an effective tool for stability. But the apology was buried in technical jargon. The lesson, however, was broadcast loud and clear to every capital city in the developing world. The West does not have your best interests at heart, and defying them is not only possible, it is the only path to survival. While Mahathir was fighting his public battle, a much quieter but far more significant shift was happening to the north. China was watching. In 1997, China was still an emerging economic power, not yet the titan it is today. It had its own internal problems, its own debts, and its own fragile banking system. The pressure on Beijing to devalue its currency, the yuan, was immense. If they had devalued, it would have set off a second wave of panic, likely destroying the remaining economies of the region. But China held the line. They refused to devalue. They provided a rock of stability while the rest of Asia crumbled. But behind the scenes, the Chinese Communist Party leadership was studying the crisis with forensic intensity. They looked at what happened to Indonesia and South Korea, and they saw a nightmare scenario that they vowed would never happen to them. They saw that opening up your capital account, allowing money to flow freely in and out, was a death sentence if you weren't strong enough to control the flow. They saw that relying on foreign loans denominated in dollars gave the United States a kill switch for your economy. The Asian financial crisis is the specific historical moment that convinced China to build the Great Firewall of Money. It solidified their resolve to never fully open their financial borders. It convinced them that the state must maintain absolute control over the banking system, that the exchange rate must be managed, and that foreign capital should be welcomed only on strict terms. The Chinese economic model that we fear and admire today, state capitalism with a closed capital account, was hardened in the fires of 1997. They realized that in the game of global finance, if you play by American rules, America wins. So they decided to play a different game. This divergence created the geopolitical fault line we stand on today. The West interpreted the 1997 crisis as a victory for the Washington Consensus, believing that eventually everyone would have to adopt free markets and democracy. Asia interpreted it as a warning that the Washington Consensus was a weapon, and they needed to build a shield. That shield was built out of the US dollar itself. This is the great irony of the post-crisis world. Having been burned by a lack of dollars, the Asian nations, led by China and a recovering South Korea and Japan, began to hoard them. They ran massive trade surpluses, exporting cheap goods to the West, and instead of spending the profit, they saved it. They bought U.S. Treasury bonds by the truckload. They accumulated billions, then trillions of dollars in foreign exchange reserves. This was not an investment strategy. It was an insurance policy. It was a war chest. The logic was simple. If the speculators ever come back, if the IMF ever tries to knock on the door again, we will have a wall of cash so high that they cannot breach it. This behavior created the global savings glut of the early 2000s. It pushed down global interest rates and flooded the U.S. financial system with cheap capital. In a cruel twist of fate, the money that Asia hoarded to protect itself from the West ended up flowing back into America, fueling the U.S. housing bubble. The fear of 1997 directly facilitated the excesses that led to the 2008 global financial crisis. The pain was transferred from the rice paddies of Thailand to the subdivisions of Florida a decade later. But the most lasting legacy of the IMF's looting of Asia is the complete collapse of trust. Before 1997, there was a genuine belief in many parts of Asia that the West, despite its colonial past, was a partner in modernization. The crisis shattered that illusion. It revealed the brutality of raw capital. It showed that when the chips are down, the international community is just a euphemism for American banking interests. This deep-seated distrust is the emotional and political foundation of the modern BRICS movement. When you hear leaders from the global South today talk about de-dollarization, about building alternative payment systems, about escaping the hegemony of the West, they are not speaking in abstracts. They are speaking from the collective memory of 1997. They remember the gold drives in Seoul. They remember the riots in Jakarta. They remember the arrogance of the IMF officials in their five-star hotels while the streets outside burned. The Asian financial crisis was the moment the American century in Asia effectively ended, not militarily, but morally. It was the moment the seeds of a multipolar world were planted in the scorched earth of the tiger economies. The West got rich off the crisis. They bought the assets, they collected the interest, they enforced their rules. But in doing so, they created a generation of rivals who would spend the next 30 years quietly sharpening their knives, building their reserves, and waiting for the moment to flip the table. That moment is what we are living through right now. The Great Rescue scam was a successful heist in the short term, but in the long term, it may prove to be the most expensive mistake the Western financial empire ever made. We are now living in the long shadow of 1997. If you want to understand the headlines of 2025, the fragmentation of the global economy, the desperate buying of gold by central banks, and the open defiance of the global South against Western sanctions, you do not look at the events of today. You look back at the scars left on the Asian psyche 30 years ago. The Great Rescue was the catalyst for a slow-motion revolution that is only now reaching its climax. For decades, Western economists comforted themselves with the idea that the Asian financial crisis was a teaching moment where the East learned to be more like the West. They believed that by forcing open markets and dismantling the crony systems, they had integrated Asia into the American-led order forever. But they misread the silence of the conquered. The East did not learn to be like the West. They learned to fear the West. And then they learned how to beat the West. The primary legacy of the looting of Asia is the weaponization of reserves. Before 1997, holding massive amounts of gold or foreign currency was seen as inefficient. Money should be put to work, invested in infrastructure or education. But after seeing how quickly a lack of liquidity could destroy a nation, the strategy changed. Security became more important than efficiency. This is why, in the years leading up to today, we have seen a historic shift in the behavior of central banks, particularly in China, but also in India, Thailand, and Singapore. They are no longer just hoarding dollars. They are systematically replacing those dollars with the only asset that has no counterparty risk, gold. The irony is palpable. In 1998, the citizens of South Korea were shamed into handing over their physical gold to pay off debts denominated in fiat paper. Today, the central banks of the East are dumping that fiat paper to buy back the physical gold. It is a reversal of the flow of real wealth. They realize that, in a crisis, paper promises from Washington or Brussels can be sanctioned, frozen, or devalued. Gold cannot be hacked, and it cannot be canceled by an IMF decree. This move toward hard assets is the direct result of the trust that was broken in Jakarta and Seoul. When the West froze the assets of Russia in 2022, it sent a shiver down the spine of every developing nation, echoing the trauma of 1997. It confirmed their deepest fear, that their dollar reserves were not really theirs. They were merely permission slips to trade, permission that could be revoked at any moment. The Asian values that the IMF mocked, savings, tangible production, industrial capacity, are now the very things that give these nations leverage. While the West financialized its economy, moving away from manufacturing and toward services and debt-based consumption, Asia kept the factories. They kept the supply chains. They kept the real economy. The rescue scam stripped them of their financial assets in the 90s, but it forced them to double down on the one thing that cannot be easily looted: the capacity to build things. Today, the West finds itself dependent on the very supply chains it helped finance during the fire sale, but it no longer owns them. The ownership has clawed its way back to domestic hands, or to state-controlled entities that are no longer interested in playing by the IMF's rules. We are witnessing the end of the lender of last resort era. The IMF's power comes from its ability to offer a lifeline when no one else will. But what happens when the desperate nations have other options? What happens when a country in crisis can turn to the BRICS Bank or to bilateral swap lines with China instead of kneeling before the IMF? The monopoly on rescue is broken. This destroys the leverage the West used to enforce its economic model. If the IMF cannot demand austerity and privatization in exchange for loans, then the mechanism for looting, for opening up markets and extracting assets, is gone. The trap no longer works if the prey has a back door. This is why the geopolitical tension is so high right now. The economic weapon that subdued the Asian tigers is blunt. The fear of being cut off from the dollar system is losing its potency because the victims of 1997 spent 30 years building a parallel system. The cycle has come full circle. In 1997, the West was the creditor, lecturing the East on the dangers of debt and cronyism. Today, the West is drowning in debt levels that would have triggered an immediate IMF intervention if they were developing nations. The United States and Europe are running deficits that are mathematically unsustainable, propped up by central bank printing presses. If the IMF applied the same strict criteria to the US today that it applied to Thailand in 1997, it would demand the immediate dismantling of the US military, the slashing of Social Security, and the selling off of national parks to foreign bidders. But the rules, as Asia learned, are for the weak, not the strong. However, strength is not static. The economic center of gravity has shifted. The Asian century that was declared dead in 1998 was only delayed, and it has returned with a vengeance, hardened by the memory of its humiliation. The great rescue scam of the late 90s was a tragedy for the millions who lost their livelihoods. It was a crime of opportunity where Wall Street feasted on the corpse of the Asian miracle. But in the long arc of history, it may be remembered as the moment the West overplayed its hand. By stripping the tigers of their wealth, they stripped them of their illusions. They created a generation of leaders who vowed that they would never again be vulnerable to the whims of foreign capital. They built high walls, they hoarded gold, and they waited. Now, as the global financial order begins to fray, as the debt burdens of the West become unbearable, and as the dollar's dominance faces its greatest challenge, the ghosts of 1997 are watching. The loot was taken, but the lesson was learned, and this time there will be no rescue. History is rarely just a record of the past. It is a blueprint for the future. The events of 1997 were not just a financial crisis. They were a lesson in power, sovereignty, and the true cost of debt. If you want to understand the economic shifts happening in the world today, you have to look at where the cracks first appeared. If you found value in this analysis and want to join us as we uncover the hidden mechanics of the global economy, please make sure to like this video. It helps us share this history with the world. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Econ Empires and turn on notifications. We are building a library of the history that matters, and we want you to be a part of it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter.